When you think of the Philippines, what comes to mind? Warm weather, long coastlines, or maybe it's notorious political corruption and shady power deals. Today's story is tightly connected to those last two ideas. In this horrific case from 1993, brutal crime tore off the facade of respectability, shook the political landscape. When all was said and done, powerful elites remained untouched, as if nothing had ever happened. It was the night of June 28, 1993, humid and warm. Mary Eileen Sarmenta, a 21-year-old university student, was on her way home. She was studying agriculture at the University of the Philippines. Earlier that day, she and her friend Alan Gomez had attended classes in Los Baños, a town in Laguna Province. The two were riding in a Toyota Tamaraw van, a common public transport vehicle in the area, which only departs when enough passengers have boarded. At that moment, only two passengers, sitting unaware of what was to come. Nearby, an ambulance pulled over. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? But suddenly, 6 heavily armed men stormed the van. In seconds, Mary and Alan were dragged out and thrown into a different vehicle. Their mouths were gagged, their hands tied, and all they could do was watch in terror as the van sped away. The ambulance that had seemed so innocent moments earlier followed closely behind, ensuring there was no escape, no hope for help. For over half an hour, they drove through the night, finally arriving at their destination, a secluded private farm, far from town. When Mary stepped out of the van and saw the farm's owner, a chilling realization struck her. She had met this man before. The person responsible for her kidnapping wasn't just anyone. It was Antonio Sanchez, the eccentric and unpredictable mayor of Colon. Mary had interviewed him once for a piece in the university newspaper. Little did she know that something so routine would set the stage for this nightmare. Mary, powerless, was led into the bedroom. Faced with the horrific assault that followed, all she could do was silently weep, enduring the nightmare. Outside the room, Alan wasn't spared either. Bored, the kidnappers took turns beating him. The torture went on for hours, only pausing when the mayor finally stepped out of the bedroom around 1 a.m. By that time, the two young victims were utterly defeated, clinging to the faint hope that they might at least escape with their lives. Sadly, that hope would soon be crushed. The van started up again. At the mayor's command, the captors took Mary and Alan on yet another journey. Later, tire tracks found by the police indicated the van had swerved violently at one point, likely a sign the pair had tried to resist. A gunshot pierced the night air, and the van slowed to a stop. Alan, bloodied and lifeless, was dragged out of the vehicle and discarded near a dump on the outskirts of town. But for Mary, the nightmare was far from over. She was driven to a nearby sugarcane field, where the men took turns assaulting her again, and when they were finished, they showed no mercy. Another gunshot rang out, ending Mary's young, vibrant life. One of the men, the only one who hadn't directly participated in the brutality, was tasked with disposing of her body, while the others quickly jumped into the ambulance and fled the scene. Perhaps out of a pang of guilt, the man didn't bother to hide Mary's body, leaving it where she had fallen, alongside the white van that had borne witness to the entire horrific ordeal. The next morning, the same ambulance sped off to a nearby town. Officially, it was dispatched for a rescue mission, but inside sat the very men responsible for the previous night's atrocities. Yes, they intended to cover their tracks by playing the role of the good guys. Upon arriving at the dump where Alan's body had been left, the men got out and feigned concern as they checked the body. Then, they quickly sped off toward City Hall, reporting the discovery of a mysterious dead man. Meanwhile, another member of the gang was reporting to the police that a young woman's body had been found in a van. The chilling part? The officer on the receiving end of the report was also part of the group. Mary was the epitome of a quiet, well-behaved girl who rarely stayed out late, let alone spent the night away from home. So, when her dorm mates noticed her unusual absence, they acted quickly. But nothing could have prepared them for what they saw when they rushed to the local police station at 8 a.m. That's where they were met with Mary's unrecognizable body. Her clothes were disheveled, clear signs that she had been violated. The marks on her knees indicated she might have knelt, desperately begging her attackers for her life. But instead of mercy, the cold-blooded killers gagged her with a handkerchief, then shot her in the face, shattering most of it, leaving only one eye intact. Her face was so disfigured that even her closest friends couldn't recognize her, identifying her only by her favorite pair of white sneakers. For her father, it was a small mole on her face that confirmed the devastating truth. Alan's identity was also confirmed by his classmates who had rushed to the scene. The forensic report documented the multiple injuries across his body, a gunshot wound, and the fatal blow to his head. 2 young lives brutally ended in a single night. Even with a powerful mayor like Antonio Sanchez as the prime suspect, there was no way to completely bury this horrific crime. News of the double murder spread quickly through the media, sparking widespread anger and fear in the community, leaving Antonio visibly shaken. Antonio Sanchez had ruled over Colón with an iron fist for years. Since becoming vice mayor in 1972 and later mayor in 1980, by 1993 he had spent over 2 decades building his empire. It was rumored that Antonio commanded his own private army and was deeply involved in organized crime, amassing a fortune through illicit activities and employing a small army of loyal enforcers. On TV, he often flaunted his devotion to the Virgin Mary, but in interviews, he would just as easily boast about keeping multiple mistresses, a fact his wife met with nothing more than a silent smile. At the time Mary interviewed him, he was already under investigation for another murder, this one involving a supporter of his political rival. But even under the cloud of that scandal, Antonio's predatory gaze fell on the young and beautiful Mary. This heartbreaking tragedy had been fueled solely by his vile desires. The brutality of the case was too much to be ignored. Multiple agencies, including the Criminal Investigation Bureau and the National Security Investigation Bureau, descended upon the small town, accompanied by an onslaught of media attention. Mary and Alan were just ordinary students, with no vices or apparent connections to any criminal activity. It was obvious to anyone reading Mary's autopsy report that more than one man had harmed her. However, Deputy Chief of Police George Medialdia had his own peculiar theory. He claimed that Alan, overcome with lust, made advances toward Mary, and when she rejected him, he lashed out in anger, ultimately killing her. Consumed by guilt and realizing he would soon be caught, George suggested Alan shot himself. Of course, this theory was full of holes. It didn't explain the other marks on Mary's body, nor did it account for the multiple injuries Alan had sustained. But what it did do was prove that the mayor was doing everything in his power to muddy the investigation. As some of you may have guessed by now, Officer George was one of the men involved in the attack that night. With the mayor pulling the strings, the police investigation moved at a snail's pace. On the surface, they claimed to be canvassing the area, questioning locals about any suspicious activity they might have heard. At the same time, they suggested that the local drug lord might have something to do with it and were awaiting the DNA test results from Mary's body. But the most crucial piece of evidence didn't come from the police. It came from a local resident who, when questioned, handed over a 5.56 millimeter shell casing he had found near the spot where Alan's body was dumped. While the police waited for the DNA results and conducted interviews, they also should have been examining the vehicle involved in the crime, looking for fingerprints, fibers, or any other potential clues. And that white van, it was supposed to be the key to the case. However, on the very day the bodies were found, something unusual caught the eye of Officer Aurelio Centeno, George's second-in-command. As he arrived at City Hall to carry out some paperwork, he noticed a white van parked outside. Several men in prison uniforms were furiously scrubbing it clean, and the van looked all too familiar. With one glance, Aurelio knew exactly what was happening. These inmates were carrying out orders from someone with significant power. He understood what was going on, but he chose to stay silent. 2 days later, on June 30th, Aurelio disappeared. Given that the bodies were found not far from the mayor's private farm, The police wasted no time reaching out to Antonio, but it wasn't because they suspected him. Instead, they were worried that the local gangs were using this incident to threaten or intimidate the mayor. Fearing that his involvement might be uncovered, Antonio quickly rejected the offer for additional police protection. Meanwhile, his efforts to cover up the crime never ceased. The bodies of Mary and Alan were discovered on June 29th, and by July, the police had finally received the DNA analysis report. They determined that 7 men had been involved in the assault on Mary, but none of the suspects' DNA matched any records in the database. With the investigation seemingly stalled, the students were outraged and took matters into their own hands. After conducting their own inquiry, they unearthed a lead, a suspicious police car that had been seen circling the university campus, following a strange pattern. Most importantly, eyewitnesses provided enough information for a sketch of the driver, and shockingly, the sketch bore a striking resemblance to the missing officer Aurelio. Meanwhile, the police shifted their focus back to the shell casing. Using the unique markings on the casing, they traced it to an M16 rifle, serial number 773159, registered to none other than police officer Luis Corcoran. Internal records revealed that although Luis had turned in his weapon, he did so only on the same day the bodies were discovered. In other words, he had more than enough time to carry out the murders. Sensing the noose tightening around him, Luis made a bold move. On July 12th, before the police could summon him, Luis, accompanied by his brother and fellow officer Rogelio Corcoran, walked into the police station and confessed to their involvement in the gruesome murders of Mary and Alan. The brothers offered a mixed bag of truth and intrigue. Yes, they admitted to being part of the group of attackers that night, but they also told a rather interesting tale, claiming that they had been acting under the orders of a general named Baracco. According to them, Baracco wanted them to eliminate a student who had gotten into a conflict with his son. The police had indeed previously investigated a boy who had clashed with Alan over a girl, a classic love triangle. While the brothers' story seemed plausible, it didn't align with the accounts of Alan's friends, who insisted that although Alan had once had a minor altercation with Baracco's son, the incident was brief and didn't lead to any lasting animosity. Given the Corcoran brothers' deep connections within the local police force, the investigators decided to transfer them to a different station for further interrogation. Conveniently, this particular station was known for its memory retrieval techniques, a euphemism for intense and often brutal interrogation methods. It's safe to say the Corcoran brothers didn't just face questioning, they faced torture. On August 10th at a flea market, police finally tracked down the missing officer Aurelio and arrested him. Did you think he disappeared because he saw the white van being cleaned? Not exactly. Aurelio had close ties to the mayor long before the incident. In fact, the last place he went before vanishing was the mayor's home, where he was handed 2,000 pesos and told to lay low out of town. Why? Because he, too, was one of the attackers that night. Aurelio confessed to being involved in the case, but claimed he didn't participate in the murder or sexual assault. He said his role was purely that of the driver. Yes, he was the one whose conscience kicked in at the end, the only man at the scene who didn't violate Mary and who left her body in the van. According to Aurelio, the kidnapping of Mary had been premeditated, just as the police had suspected. On the morning of June 28th, the same day of the crime, Aurelio introduced the others involved in the plot. The group included Deputy Chief George, the Corcoran brothers, another officer named Zoilo Ama, the mayor's nephew Baldwin Bryan, and Antonio's gardener Pepito Kawit. Once they got in the car, the men discussed how they were going to fetch a gift for the mayor, a gift that Antonio had been coveting for a while. Mary Eileen Sarmenta. They spent most of the day driving around the university campus, hunting for Mary. In other words, the entire plan had been orchestrated by the mayor himself, with the police carrying it out. This also explained why they initially tried to pin the blame on Alan, framing him as a killer. They knew that implicating a living person was far riskier. To avoid raising any suspicions, the 5 men, excluding the mayor, were brought in for questioning. At first, none of them were cooperative, But after a round of the infamous memory retrieval techniques, they slowly began to reveal what the police had already suspected. On August 13th, just 3 days after Aurelio was arrested, Mayor Antonio Sanchez was finally taken into custody. However, one of the key pieces of evidence in the case, the white van, had already been thoroughly cleaned. Additionally, the bullet casing found at the scene couldn't be directly linked to Antonio. This made Aurelio's testimony all the more critical, as his cooperation turned him into the star witness for the prosecution. His assistance gave the prosecutors enough reason to press forward with the case, and in return, Aurelio avoided prosecution. Naturally, Antonio denied all charges against him. His alibi was almost laughably simplistic. He claimed that at the time of the crime, he had been with his mistress. But that flimsy excuse failed to explain his strange behavior in the days following the incident. If he truly had nothing to do with the crime, why had he been spending huge sums of money, trying to bribe the media and those in high places to cover up the truth? Thanks to Aurelio's testimony, on September 12, 1993, the prosecutor successfully filed charges against Antonio and the rest of his gang. The trial was long and drawn out, lasting a grueling 16 months. Throughout the proceedings, Antonio denied having any motive for the crime, claiming that he could get any woman he wanted with his money. There was no need to resort to such measures. He even had the audacity to smile at times during the trial, seemingly mocking the gravity of the situation. On March 11, 1995, the judge finally delivered the verdict. The court convicted all 8 members of the gang, with Antonio at the helm, on charges of rape and double murder, referring to the crime as a conspiracy from hell. Antonio was sentenced to 7 life terms, with each carrying a maximum of 40 years, totaling 280 years behind bars. Antonio was far from pleased with the outcome. The man who had often portrayed himself as a devout believer was now standing in court, furiously shouting his innocence, his face twisted in anger. On August 29, 1999, Antonio Sanchez was convicted once again in a separate double murder case, adding 2 more life sentences to his already staggering term. This brought his total sentence to 360 years. Despite being locked away, Antonio continued to maintain his innocence, insisting that he was a victim of a political conspiracy. With a 360-year sentence, it might seem like justice had been served. But according to reports, life in prison for Antonio wasn't exactly harsh. His cell was filled with religious trinkets, his usual favorites, and though small, it was anything but uncomfortable. He enjoyed air conditioning, access to television, drugs, and even had someone to hold an umbrella for him when needed. On August 20th, 2019, the case resurfaced and sparked nationwide outrage in the Philippines. The Bureau of Corrections director announced that Antonio might be released in 2 months, citing a 2013 law allowing inmates to shorten their sentences through good behavior. This news infuriated not only the families of Mary and Alan, but also the general public. To make matters worse, Antonio's family had refused to pay the court-ordered compensation of 12.6 million pesos. Faced with overwhelming public anger, the authorities who initially approved Antonio's release quickly reversed course. The prison bureau director, who had signed off on his release, was dismissed on September 4th, and the release plan was scrapped. On the morning of March 27th, 2021, at around 8:30 a.m., Antonio Sanchez died in prison at the age of 72. The exact cause of death was unclear, but foul play was not suspected. Given his history of chronic illnesses, including kidney disease, diabetes, and hypertension, his passing wasn't entirely unexpected. Yet, even his death brought little comfort to the families of Mary and Alan, who were left to live with their grief in a world without their loved ones. To make matters worse, they never received so much as an apology from the man who caused their suffering.